The interview is one of the single most popular selection tools in education, in business settings. Almost every company relies on face-to-face job interviews. The evidence on interviews is quite damning. That is to say, they're fairly lousy selection tools when it comes to predicting actual job performance. There have been probably hundreds of studies looking at various types of interviews and trying to correlate that interview performance with future job performance. So studies within corporations looking at how people do on their selection interviews at the time of employment, and then their performance in the future, how long they stay at the company, how far they get promoted, how well their bosses say they're doing. And there are studies that have done this correctly. That is, they interview a wide variety of applicants, and then they don't just select the ones who do well on the interview. They select either everybody or they select randomly, and then they can look at the entire range of performance and ask whether employment interviews are actually useful for predicting future performance. A statistic that psychologists rely on quite frequently to demonstrate the association between two variables is the correlation coefficient, which can run between 0 and 1 for a positive correlation between two things, like ideally interview performance and job performance. A correlation of 0 would indicate no relationship whatsoever, and a correlation of 1 would indicate perfect relationship. And the correlations between standard employment interviews, unstructured face-to-face job interviews, and future job performance usually ranges between 0.1 and 0.2. That is, fairly mediocre association between the two. I think that there are a number of reasons why companies continue to use interviews despite their poor quality as predictors of future job performance. One is that companies very rarely bother to collect the evidence that would allow them to test whether employment interviews actually are helpful for selecting good employees. Another is that every interviewer would like to imagine that he or she has the insight and perspicacity to detect good employees, to tell whether someone's a good fit at the company or whether their performance in the future will be good. We like to believe that we're good judges of character. The evidence, however, quite clearly shows that on average people are lousy interviewers. Each person would like to, even if they know that evidence, when I talk about this in class, students frequently say, well, maybe there are lots of bad interviewers out there, but me, I'm a good judge of character. The evidence suggests that we should be skeptical of that. Part of the reason why the interview isn't a better selection technique is the fact that the traits and abilities that lead people to do well in job interviews are only distantly related to the traits and behaviors that lead them to do well on the job later. So things that help you do well in job interviews are physical attractiveness, sociability, extroversion, Machiavellianism, that is the ability to manipulate others for your own ends. And there are certainly some jobs in which these skills are relevant to performance. There are some jobs in which these skills actually impair performance, but the skills, the set of skills which is useful in the job interview aren't consistently related to the skills that are important for performing in the workplace. There are some features inherent to the interview process that insert problems, biases into the candidate's performance and into judgments made by the interviewer. The most notable of these biases is the fact that interviewees tend to be evaluated more positively by the interviewer if they look like the interviewer, if they sound like the interviewer, if they're similar to the interviewer with respect to cultural orientation or values, and in many cases these are factors that are irrelevant to work performance. Some of the other problems that are inherent to the interview process and to human evaluation of others' performances include features like stereotypes, So our beliefs about a person, the categories that a person belongs to, their gender, their race, their age, will influence our perceptions of their performance in the interview, often in ways that are consistent with this stereotype. There are also effects such as primacy and recency, where whatever happens at the end of the interview or at the very beginning will be particularly salient to the interviewer, even when that isn't necessarily any more revealing of the candidate's abilities. The interview is a complex cognitive process, and some of the reasons why it's hard to infer people's abilities based on face-to-face experience with them, such as an interview, have to do with a problem in social psychology known as situationism. That is a large body of evidence that's accumulated that suggests quite strongly that situations are much stronger predictions of individual behavior than our personalities. So people believe very strongly in the power of individual differences and in personality differences between people as predictors of future behavior. It turns out that they're pretty lousy. And some keys to predicting how people will behave once you get them inside your organization include things like your organizational culture and what it does to people. There are often interactions there where different people will react in different ways to your organizational culture, the pressures that exist in the workplace at your firm, and those can often be very difficult to predict based on how someone performs in a job interview. Being an interviewer is challenging. The complexities of interviewing make it a demanding task. Human attention is limited in its capacity. There are only so many things that we can pay attention to and remember. And in an interview, there are lots of things going on. There's what the person's saying, there's their nonverbal body language, and our expectations for that person, our own prejudices, whatever we happen to be distracted with at the moment, the mood we happen to be in, the emotions we're feeling, what happened to us right before the interview. All these things make it more difficult for us to process the information that we get from the interviewee in an unbiased way and add noise to the equation. They make any given interview only an imperfect measure of the performance of the interviewee in that meeting. The interview will remain a popular selection tool regardless of what I say. The evidence has been in for years, for decades, about the problems with job interviews. If firms want to improve the way that they make employment and hiring decisions, the first thing that they ought to do is structure their job interviews. That is to say, every interviewer picks a set of questions, asks the same set of questions in the same order of every candidate, that every candidate meets the same interviewers. And this structure to the interviews helps increase their validity by reducing the noise, by reducing the variability in the performance of each candidate due to differences in the situations that they face. Every employer also ought to consider selection tools other than the job interview. For interviewers, training is essential. It is surprisingly common for interviewers to ask questions that are illegal. Very few managers receive any formal training in how to use interviews and how to avoid violating the law when using interviews. So there's been enough research on the question that we have a pretty good sense of how interviews can be structured to improve their quality and predictive validity. You can improve the problem a little bit by having lots of different interviewers, and each one will be a noisy measure, an imperfect measure of the candidate's performance. When you average them together, you will, one would hope, average out some of that noise. But for all of those reasons, any given interview is a highly imperfect measure of any given candidate's ability. Firms that want to do better interviewing may be interested in doing their own statistical analyses and assessing the degree to which their employment interviews are useful tools for selecting employees. Doing that analysis it is not that complicated, but it does require some specialized knowledge. And most firms will probably benefit from the advice of someone who's trained in experimental design and statistical methods to help them make those sorts of decisions. Interviews are very expensive selection tools. They require the time and attention of many managers. There are expenses associated with getting candidates and managers in the same place to have the employment interviews happen. Relative to those costs, the costs associated with improving the quality of interviews to make them better selection tools is tiny. There are a number of cheaper alternatives to the employment interview, alternatives that are simpler to administer, less financially costly, and better predictors of actual future job performance. Given that most employers don't know what traits actually make employees successful at their firm, it turns out that one of the simplest and most effective selection tools is measuring candidates' intelligence. So there are tests of general mental ability that have correlations of 0.5 or 0.6 with job performance, whereas employment interviews are much worse than that, correlations of 0.1 or 0.2. So a simple intelligence test, which could be administered by anyone and would take a matter of 30 minutes or an hour, will be a much better predictor of future job performance than a day of interviews. Management consulting firms have gone to using what they call mini cases, where they ask interviewees to solve some problem, some complex problem in the interview with the goal of examining their thought processes. And if those mini cases are selected in such a way that they're actually representative of the sorts of problems that an employee will face on the job subsequently, they can be more useful. There's still alternative tools that are dramatically better than the interview, but they get better as you structure them and use problems, ask participants in the interviewee to solve problems that are predictive of the sorts of problems they'll be solving in the workplace. Job tryouts, where you actually get people in doing the job and have them experience the job, and you test their performance over a period of time. That's a great predictor. It's usually not viable. In fact, that job tryouts are better than tests of general mental ability. That shouldn't be surprising. You want to predict how someone's going to do on the job, you actually put them on the job for a period of time and see how they do. Job tryouts aren't usually feasible in most situations. Internships are a fantastic opportunity for employers to learn about candidates beforehand. It's a way of seeing them on the job and actually getting experience with their performance firsthand. So partnerships between academic institutions and corporations can often serve that interest, helping the corporations get experience with that particular candidate on the job, and also helping that candidate get some experience with the firm to figure out if they're really up for the job. The conclusions of the book, as a whole, I'd have to say, are quite pessimistic. That is, no one really thinks that we can get rid of conflicts of interest. All the authors in the book would agree that conflicts of interest are pervasive, that they're faced by every profession, and that it's unrealistic to think that we'll be able to eliminate them at any point in the foreseeable future. The types of regulatory interventions and changes in most professions that would eliminate conflicts of interest are too costly and impractical to consider. For instance, in the medical profession, there's a conflict of interest between the patient's care and the physician's income. So a medical professional might, if their judgment is biased by this conflict of interest, might lean more towards some diagnoses than others. The solution? Well, you get your treatment and your diagnosis from different physicians. Well, what a pain. This would eliminate the conflicts of interest inherent in diagnosing patients' conditions, but it introduces all sorts of other costs. And then you have to start asking complicated questions like, how costly is the conflict of interest, and how do those costs compare with the costs of what it would take to eliminate it? Those are often very difficult questions to answer. It's an important question to ask, why conflicts of interest occur and what leads them to have negative consequences. In examining cases of conflicts of interest, such as those among auditing firms or among medical researchers, the popular press tends to focus on conscious corruption. That is, the notion that an individual's or a firm's private interest in gaining money contaminates their judgments and does so in a way that they're consciously aware of, that they indulge in their private interest at the expense of their clients. This happens occasionally, as for instance in the case of, say, Jack Grubman, who was offering advice publicly that people should buy stocks of the firms that his employer was trying to support, even though privately he was sending emails to his colleagues saying very negative things about these very stocks. So occasionally it is the case that you get this sort of conscious corruption. People are aware that they're lying. But it's much more common for conflicts of interest to have their effects in much more subtle ways. Physicians, as a whole, are good people who try to practice medicine in ways that help their patients. Even if their judgments are influenced by their own financial interests, we believe that it is, the research that I've done with my colleagues suggests that it is very rarely the case that physicians think, well, this patient really doesn't need the surgery, but I'm going to recommend the surgery because it'll mean a couple $1,000s for me. That may happen sometimes, but it's probably more the exception than the rule. Much more common is for the physician to persuade him or herself through selective examination of the evidence that the patient really needs the surgery that will generate income for the physician. And this isn't something that's unique to physicians or to auditors or other professionals. We all do this. The human mind is remarkably good at coming to the conclusions that it wants to come to. We prefer to believe that which is good for us, and we're quite good at helping ourselves come to those conclusions, even when the facts aren't particularly cooperative. So people review evidence selectively. They are more easily persuaded by evidence that's consistent with what they would like to believe than evidence that contradicts what they would like to believe. What's important in understanding the psychology of conflict of interest is that people are generally not aware of the selective way they evaluate evidence. And so even though they have subjected evidence that's consistent with their desired conclusions and evidence that's inconsistent with their desired conclusions to very different standards of scrutiny, because they're unaware of this selective attention, they think of themselves as fair and objective, even though their conclusions have been strongly influenced by their own personal interests. Many of the most popular solutions to conflicts of interest are based on assumptions of human rationality. So for instance, one of the most popular responses is disclosure of conflicts of interest. That is to say, the physician should have to report their ties to the pharmaceutical industry. When they send something to a journal, they should report how much they've been paid by the pharmaceutical who manufactures the drug tested in their report. That assumes that the person reading the article has a perfect sense of exactly how that money from the pharmaceutical will have biased the physician's judgment or influenced the way that they analyze their data, and how that might affect the conclusions that they come to in their paper. That's a very big assumption about the sophistication of the audiences for these sorts of information. When your real estate agent tells you, my money comes from the seller, so you as the buyer don't pay me directly, and I get paid more by the seller when the price you pay is higher. Well, how does that influence what your real estate agent tells you about how much a home is worth? There are many assumptions underlying how disclosure will operate, including the assumption that it will not influence the content of the advice itself. research that I've done with colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon, including my student Dalian Kane and my colleague George Lowenstein, show that disclosure can influence the quality of the advice that's given. That is to say, when I, as your advisor, know that I'm going to have to disclose my conflict of interest, my advice gets worse. So I'm your agent and I have to tell you I get paid more when the house sells for more. Well, I'm going to start thinking, oh boy, he's going to be suspicious of my motive. So if I'm going to get him to pay a high price, I really better tell him what a great house this is. And what you get is exaggeration such that advice gets worse in the presence of a disclosure rather than better. And that would be fine if the consumers of the advice, home buyers for instance, understood that all of this was the case. But the evidence suggests quite clearly that they don't have that second level of sophistication. So you provide the disclosure and they do become more suspicious of their advisor's motives, but they don't adjust the advice enough. They don't discount it as much as they should, given that it has just gotten worse in the presence of the disclosure. What I've said so far paints a fairly pessimistic picture of the problems created by conflicts of interest for the lives of modern professionals. And I actually am not sure that I've been quite negative enough. Most people, upon hearing the evidence, think, oh boy, other people really are prone to bias. In fact, this is a common response whenever people hear about research on biases in human judgment and decision making. It's much more rare for people to acknowledge the ways that their own judgments are likely to be biased. I think that the set of recommendations that emerge from the work that I've been doing on conflicts of interest are complicated and messy. They're costly, and they depend on the different situations faced by different professionals. So what should we do to address the conflicts of interest inherent in the practice of medicine? We can institute rules about what sorts of decisions physicians can make, whether one physician diagnoses treatment and also diagnoses the disease and provides treatment to the same patient. We can make rules about whether physicians can refer patients to clinics that they own or to colleagues that they have a financial relationship with. But the simplest solution to conflicts of interest is often their disclosure. And as I've already talked about, research suggests that we ought to be skeptical about the ability of disclosure to solve these problems. The more expensive solutions to conflicts of interest are recusal and divestiture. So recusal means that the person with a conflict of interest removes him or herself completely from the decision that's relevant to that conflict of interest. And this is instituted in some situations. So certainly if a judge is asked to rule on the fate of a firm in which the judge has significant ownership stake, the judge ought to recuse him or herself from that case, and another judge should step in. Divestiture would be required in cases where the judge, say for instance, has to rule on that case, and then the judge would be forced to sell their stock. So for instance, Dick Cheney had a big ownership stake in Halliburton. He had to sell that ownership stake before becoming vice president. He was going to make decisions as vice president that influenced Halliburton and its fate. And so his selling of Halliburton stock serves as a divestiture of that conflict of interest. Again, though, it's easy to argue that that's an insufficient solution, given the fact that his financial interest in the Halliburton Corporation will continue past his tenure as vice president, and that he's still got friends at Halliburton, that he knows the company well, and he's got all sorts of reasons to want Halliburton to do well, even if he's not profiting directly from its prosperity. where the problem is. Does the problem lie with the firm and firms that haven't appropriately established their incentives for employees? Does the problem lie with the structure of industries, as my colleagues and I have argued that is the case with the auditing industry? Does the problem lie with individuals and individuals' proneness to bias? My colleagues in accounting departments often focus on the incentives present for accounting firms when they talk about the conflicts of interest inherent in the auditing profession. And I think it's easier to argue that accounting firms face incentives that ought to reduce their conflicts of interest. So, for instance, audit firms have a real stake in their reputation and have a significant interest in avoiding the fate of Arthur Andersen. There were very few employees of Arthur Andersen who faced legal consequences of the firm's demise. So David Duncan, the lead auditor on the Enron case, he did face trial. But for most of the employees at Arthur Andersen, their incentives were not in perfect alignment with those of the organization, in part because of things like the possibility that they would one day go work for a client. To the degree that their interest is aligned with that of the client, they may not be all that motivated to serve the interests of Arthur Andersen and its long-term future viability. So yes, there are important issues having to do with misalignment between the interests of a firm and its employees. But the perpetuation of conflict of interest in many industries is occurring at both levels, both the individual and the organization for which the individual works. On a more positive note, it's easy to envision employers and employee relationships that do something to ameliorate the potential conflicts of interest. Many professional organizations, including the American Bar Association, the American Medical Association, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, these professional organizations have professional ethical codes of conduct that seek to clarify the rules and often address quite directly conflicts of interest faced by people in these professions. The sentiments expressed in those codes of conduct are often quite noble, but often fantastically unrealistic when it comes to actually managing the details of conflicts of interest. So, for instance, the Code of Conduct for the American Medical Association instructs doctors that they should never place their own financial interest above the interests of their patients. Well, if they followed that prescription, they wouldn't charge for any of their services, because it's in their patient's interest to get the services, and they should never place their own financial interests above their patients. So it's just sort of an unrealistically vague guideline with no teeth for any sort of enforcement, no regulatory mechanism. There are some situations in which professional organizations have taken a more active step in trying to regulate their members' conflicts of interest. When does that happen? That happens when the industry fears government intervention and they're trying to stave off that government intervention by taking action themselves, which they hope will be less costly to their members than would government regulation. Many business schools have begun to struggle in serious ways with ethical issues. The Enron collapse led to a great deal of soul searching in the business world, and many business schools have started implementing more formal curricula surrounding ethics. Often that means required courses dedicated to the teaching of ethics. There's real potential value in teaching ethics. My own perspective is that it's useful to teach students to think about ethical problems in ways that will help arm them when it comes time to actually face those decisions in the workplace. That people make bad decisions. It's easy for people to make bad decisions when they face a challenge without having prepared for it. People are most likely to make decisions that violate their own ethical principles when they haven't taken the time to think through responses that might be more consistent with their own values before they face the situation. And so a class on ethics can be useful in putting students in the vice of an ethical quandary, having them think deeply about the sorts of challenges they'll face in the workplace when, for instance, an employer or a boss asks them to do something that violates their own values, and how they would potentially respond. Organizations' interests in ethical behavior are more complex. So on the one hand, firms would like to believe that they behave ethically and certainly would like to avoid legal prosecution. On the other hand, behaving ethically is not always what's most profitable. And insubordination is costly for most firms. And having employees making their own decisions about what's ethical and what's not can be annoying for upper management. One of the real values that can be delivered in a course on ethics is to address the processes underlying conflicts of interest, as I've been talking about. So because so many of these processes operate at an unconscious level, raising people's awareness of their own tendencies to engage in these sorts of biases can help. As I've said, people tend to be reluctant to admit their own susceptibility to bias, but the first step is raising people's awareness, and evidence does suggest that understanding the ways in which you are vulnerable to bias and to decision errors and to unethical temptation, it tends to improve your ability to resist. It's not perfect. Potential workplace solutions to the problems raised by conflicts of interest are sometimes messy. There are many situations in which firms are tempted to engage in behavior that is ethically questionable. And one potential solution, a solution, by the way, that has many benefits outside of conflicts of interest and ethical decisions generally, is the practice of appointing a devil's advocate. That is someone whose job it is to raise serious questions about the course of action that the firm is planning on engaging in. It's quite common for decisions to be made at the top of an organization, and then they go about marshaling the resources to implement that decision, hiring management consultants to justify that it was a good decision, giving people job assignments to help them carry out that decision, and the amount of time spent reflecting on alternative courses of action and questioning whether that one strategy is the right one to pursue are often neglected. So managers are often in a sort of implemental mindset and more rarely in a reflective mindset of considering all the possible courses of action and asking what are the problems with the courses of action that we're considering pursuing. Should I say more about that? Like consider the opposite approaches.
Go ahead.
So one of the most common debiasing strategies that's been used in decision-making research is one in which decision makers are asked to consider the opposite. That is, whatever it is you're thinking about, you think this applicant is a good potential employee. What are the reasons why that might not be right? You think that you really ought to develop your capacity in China. Well, what are the reasons why that's not such a good idea? Consider the opposite of whatever it is that you're heading towards. Can help reveal the weaknesses in the case that you've been making and help reveal the weaknesses in the strategy that you've been considering.